There comes a time in life when silence begins to whisper things that human ears cannot comprehend. An instant when the air feels denser, the light more vivid, and the visible world merges with something that does not entirely belong to it. It is at this threshold that many report seeing figures, subtle presences, formless shapes, shadows that seem to observe without intending to frighten. Most fear this encounter, but few realize that perhaps what they see is not a threat but a sign. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, spoke of this with disarming serenity. He said that there are times when the veil between worlds becomes so thin that the spirit begins to perceive what has always been there, but hidden from eyes accustomed to matter. And it is at this instant, when the invisible touches the visible, that the soul begins to prepare for a passage, not necessarily death, but a deep inner journey. Cayce believed that seeing what we call figures is, in many cases, an awakening of spiritual perception. He claimed that human beings are surrounded by energetic fields, and that when these fields expand, due to illness, grief, meditation, or inner transformation, the person begins to see subtle planes of existence. Imagine your consciousness as a window covered by thin layers of dust. With each intense life experience, a loss, a love, a pain, a revelation, some of that dust dissipates, and for a brief moment you see through. What once seemed empty now pulsates, and when this happens, many are frightened, feeling that something abnormal is before them, without realizing that the abnormal is precisely living without seeing this presence that always accompanies us. But what then are these figures? Cayce said that not everything that manifests in the gloom is a disembodied spirit. Sometimes they are projections of the expanded mind itself, energetic echoes of thoughts, emotions, and memories that become visible when our vibration changes. Other times, they are real spiritual presences, beings that inhabit planes close to ours and make themselves known when there is a purpose in their approach. The difference lies in the vibration. That which causes fear and cold in the chest generally reflects the internal fear of the one who sees, not the nature of what is seen. The figure can be a living metaphor for what has not yet been understood within us, the shadows of the unconscious, the fragments of the soul that ask for light. Seeing figures, therefore, is not a punishment, but a call. It is the universe's way of gently tapping the soul's shoulder and asking, "Are you ready to see what has always been here?" Cayce taught that fear is the first veil to be torn, and that every authentic spiritual experience begins with the courage to remain before the unknown without fleeing. It is at this point that the journey begins. For seeing is just the beginning. The true process is to understand what has been seen. There is an ancient story told by a disciple of Cayce who one night during a reading session asked if he was being chased by shadows. Cayce, in a trance, replied, "Nothing chases you, only your own light trying to break through the layers that hide it." This phrase became one of the most beautiful metaphors for self-knowledge. The shadows we see outside are often the pieces of light we have not yet recognized within. As the soul grows, it approaches the border between the visible and invisible worlds. And this border is alive, pulsating, made of energy, of memories, of presences that observe the journey of those who awaken. It is curious how so many different cultures describe the same phenomenon with distinct names. The Japanese speak of yurei, subtle spirits that manifest when there is an imbalance between the world of the living and the dead. The ancient Egyptians spoke of the ka, the essence that accompanies a person even after death. And the indigenous peoples of the Americas describe the spirits of the gloom, messengers who warn when a cycle of life is about to change. All these accounts converge at the same point. There are times when the veil becomes translucent, and it is impossible not to feel the approach of the invisible. Cayce warned that when this happens, we must maintain serenity. Fear closes the field, love expands it, and it is in expansion that understanding flourishes. He said that the approach of these presences is a sign that the soul is ready to learn something that cannot be taught in books. Sometimes it is the beginning of a psychic journey, other times the premonition of an inner healing, and in rarer cases, the foreboding of an imminent departure. But even death for Cayce was not an end, only a passage between vibrational dimensions. If the vision of figures precedes a passage, it does not announce tragedy but transition. It is the energetic echo of a soul that begins to detach from the weight of matter, even while continuing to live physically. Many report that before a profound transformation, a serious illness, a spiritual awakening, or even a great loss, they began to feel presences, see shadows, perceive subtle movements in the periphery of their vision. It is as if the world is saying, "Prepare yourself. Something within you is about to change frequency." These experiences, however frightening they may seem, are invitations to surrender. Cayce insisted that the soul is never alone. Even in the hours when everything seems dark, there is silent support. The presences we perceive can be guides, disembodied relatives, or even symbolic manifestations of our own higher self, trying to communicate in a way that the rational mind does not yet comprehend. Seeing figures, therefore, can be a primitive way of seeing the invisible, a spiritual language we do not yet know how to translate into words. It is important to remember that the human eye does not see the world as it is, but as it has been trained to see. Our eyes capture only a tiny fraction of the light spectrum. What we call reality is, in fact, a very narrow vibrational slice. Cayce said that spiritual senses, sight, hearing, and soul perception, are infinitely broader, and that, in states of openness, consciousness begins to perceive dimensions that coexist with ours. The problem is that in trying to interpret this with the common mind, we end up distorting the meaning, dressing the mystery in the clothes of fear. Some say seeing figures is madness, others say it is a gift. Cayce said it is remembrance, an ancient remembrance from when the soul had not yet completely separated from the whole and could walk between worlds. He called this ability awakened soul vision, a state in which the human spirit once again perceives its multidimensional nature. When this happens, everything changes. Time slows down, space dissolves, and the person feels, for a brief instant, that life is much vaster than they ever imagined. And perhaps this is what frightens most, not the shadows themselves, but what they reveal, the certainty that we have never truly been alone, and that there is something within us that belongs to a place that cannot be touched. When Cayce spoke of the passage that is near, he was not referring only to death, but to the journey of consciousness, the moment we stop being merely bodies walking on earth and begin to remember that we are souls walking between worlds. There is something deeply mysterious in the instant when the human eye begins to see beyond what is visible. Cayce used to say that the invisible is only the visible at another frequency, and that the human soul is an infinitely more sensitive instrument of reception than the senses can comprehend. When someone begins to see figures, what is actually happening is a tuning, as if an ancient spiritual station were broadcasting again, and the soul, long silent, were once again hearing its own language. This tuning, however, is delicate. It can generate peace but also confusion. It can bring revelation but also fear. And fear, according to Cayce, is the great distorting agent of spiritual vision. It does not block the gift, but scrambles it, transforming light into shadow and message into threat. Therefore, Cayce insisted on the importance of inner preparation. It is not about learning esoteric techniques, but about cultivating emotional purity, mental serenity, and sincere love. When the soul's vibration is peaceful, everything that manifests around it responds to that harmony. He compared this to the surface of a lake. When it is calm, it reflects the sky. When it is agitated, it distorts everything it sees. Similarly, an agitated mind sees frightening figures. A serene mind sees luminous presences. The difference is not in what manifests, but in the eye of the beholder. This understanding radically transforms the meaning of seeing figures. It ceases to be a supernatural event and becomes a spiritual mirror. Cayce said that every shadow is a lesson that asks for light, and that the manifestations that visit us are opportunities for learning. In some cases, they are energetic fragments of old emotions, traumas, memories that continue to vibrate around us like echoes of the past. As the soul matures and expands, it begins to perceive these echoes and, upon recognizing them, can finally release them. This is why many people report feeling deep peace after the initial fear, as if, by seeing the figure, they had faced something that was trapped within them. But there is also another layer of understanding, what Cayce called the presence of messengers. He believed that the spiritual plane is inhabited by entities of different levels of consciousness, some closer to the light, others still learning, just like us. These beings can approach when there is vibrational resonance, or when there is something to be communicated. Cayce did not see this as a mystical curiosity, but as a natural consequence of the interconnectedness between dimensions. He stated that the world of spirits is only one vibration above matter, not a distant place. Thus, when someone sees figures, they may, in fact, be participating in an encounter between dimensions, a silent dialogue between coexisting worlds. However, there is a fine line between spiritual perception and spiritual fascination. Cayce warned about the danger of fixating on appearances, of seeking power in manifestations, or of feeling special for seeing what others do not. For him, every gift not sustained by humility becomes corrupted. Spiritual vision is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. He who sees must serve, he said. To see is to remember that the universe is alive, that everything is consciousness, and whoever awakens to this is called to live with more love, more compassion, more discernment. The purpose is not to see the invisible, but to make the visible more sacred. Cayce also said that visions of figures intensify when there is an energetic imbalance in the environment or in the body. He spoke of centers of force, what we now call chakras, as vibrational portals. When one of these centers is overloaded, perception can be altered. Therefore, he saw the body not as something separate from spirituality, but as its temple and instrument. A tired, intoxicated, or emotionally wounded body distorts spiritual perception. A body in harmony amplifies the divine presence. Thus, caring for the body, breathing consciously, eating lightly, resting and meditating are not trivial gestures. They are ways to calibrate the soul's antenna. There is a point where this perception ceases to be frightening and becomes sacred. It is when the observer understands that the figures are not enemies but signs that consciousness is expanding its field, signs that reality is greater than the material world, and above all, signs that something within us is ready to cross a boundary. Cayce said that every deep spiritual process is preceded by signs at the edge of vision. What appears in the shadows is a premonition of what is about to be born in light. Many of his accounts speak of people who, after periods of seeing figures, experience miraculous healings or intense inner transformations. He explained that by touching subtle planes, the soul receives a shock of vibrational energy that can reorganize the vital field, something like a spiritual recalibration. The perception of the invisible in these cases would be the external reflection of this internal transformation. The body reacts, energy moves, and consciousness expands. Seeing figures, then, becomes the symptom of a metamorphosis. Cayce saw life as a succession of passages, small deaths and rebirths. The passage near was not just the act of leaving the body, but every moment in which the soul frees itself from an old way of being. Some die while still living, and some are reborn every day. The true meaning of seeing the veil open is to recognize that we are about to cross one of these passages. Sometimes it is the end of a phase of suffering. Other times, the beginning of a spiritual calling. And yes, in certain cases, the soul anticipates that its physical time is coming to an end. But this, for Cayce, is no cause for fear. It is merely the natural return of the soul to its origin. For those who experience it and do not know how to cope, Cayce left 3 simple and profound pieces of advice. First, do not fear. Second, pray. Third, love. Fear closes the heart. Prayer aligns it. Love opens it. These 3 attitudes are like vibrational keys that transform any presence around. When the soul vibrates in love, everything that is shadow dissipates or transforms. And if something remains, it is because it carries a message to be understood. In this sense, prayer, not as a ritual but as a state of surrender, becomes the means by which the invisible is translated into wisdom. Cayce affirmed that over many lives, the soul gradually loses the memory of what it is to truly see spiritually. But at certain moments, by destiny or by necessity, this memory resurfaces. It is as if the spirit is saying, "Now, remember who you are." And, in this reminder, the world begins to behave differently. Coincidences intensify, dreams become more vivid, time seems to fold. Everything around begins to participate in the same subtle symphony. The figure that once caused fear is now understood as a chord of this silent music. Ultimately, seeing figures is just one of many ways to perceive that life does not end where the eyes cease. And this perception, though unsettling, is liberating, because it invites us to look at the world with more reverence, like someone walking in an invisible temple, surrounded by benevolent presences that witness our journey. Cayce said that, when the soul begins to see, the entire universe bows to welcome it. This is the true meaning of awakening, not to see more but to feel part of the whole that has always been looking back at us. There is an instant when fear subsides and mystery begins to reveal itself in silence. Cayce said that when the heart accepts the invisible with serenity, what seemed like a shadow transforms into a presence. What once frightened becomes familiar, almost sacred. It's like entering a dark room and, upon lighting a candle, realizing that what moved in the shadows was just light, trying to find a way. Such is the awakening of spiritual vision, a process of inner illumination, where the soul's gaze learns to distinguish projection from truth, disordered energy from divine message. When the soul awakens, reality changes its texture. Common things, a tree swaying in the wind, a shadow in the hallway, the silence of dawn, begin to carry meanings that did not exist before. It is as if the material world becomes translucent, and behind it we can feel the pulse of something greater. Cayce called this the vibration of the spirit in motion. He said that the spirit is always communicating, always trying to manifest, but that human beings lost in noise and distractions rarely listen. Seeing figures, feeling presences, hearing subtle whispers, all these are ways by which the invisible calls the attention of the visible, asking, "Wake up, remember." This awakening, however, is not without trials. Cayce affirmed that the closer the soul is to crossing a passage, the more intense the signs around it become. Not because something evil is approaching, but because the person's energetic field begins to vibrate at a transition frequency, something between the world of form and the world of spirit. He compared this to a sunset, the moment when the day has not yet ended, but night has already begun. In this twilight of the soul, everything mixes, the real and the symbolic, the earthly and the sacred. And it is at this point that many get lost, for they try to understand with the mind what can only be comprehended with the heart. Cayce recommended, in these moments, a simple and profound practice: inner recollection. When the veil becomes thin, silence is the greatest guide, he said. Instead of trying to push away what manifests, one must listen. Listen not with the ears, but with presence. Allow the mystery to reveal itself in due time without anxiety. The soul that learns to quiet itself discovers that the invisible is not chaotic. It is orderly, patient, compassionate. Confusion comes only from the human haste to want to transform spiritual experience into rational explanation. Seeing figures is often the first stage of a deeper call, the call of spiritual remembrance. The soul begins to recall that it existed before the body, and that it will continue to exist after it. This remembrance changes everything. Cayce said that when a human being recognizes themselves as a soul, the fear of death begins to dissolve, and along with it the rigidity of the ego. The person begins to live with more lightness because they understand that nothing truly ends. The presences that appear, be they lights, figures, or subtle sensations, cease to be signs of threat and become reminders of eternity. There's a fascinating point in Cayce's readings. He describes that as the passage approaches, whether the passage of physical death or a profound spiritual transformation, the soul begins to see not only figures, but also luminous forms. He called them those who wait in the light. These are loving consciousnesses, linked to us by affinity, who approach to facilitate the journey. In near-death states, many people report seeing exactly this: figures of light, serene faces, presences that transmit peace. Cayce said that this vision is proof that love knows no boundaries between worlds. The same love that guides the soul at birth is what welcomes it at departure. But not all passages are final. Sometimes what approaches is the end of an identity, a belief, a way of living. And these symbolic deaths are, in essence, as sacred as physical death. Cayce believed that the universe operates in cycles: life, transformation, death, and rebirth. Each cycle brings a new layer of consciousness. When the soul perceives figures, it is as if it is witnessing the dissolution of an old layer of itself, an energetic skin that is being left behind. That is why he said, "Do not fear what disappears before your eyes. Fear only what remains motionless within your heart." In these periods of transition, synchronicities multiply. Vivid dreams, improbable coincidences, feelings of déjà vu. All of this is part of the same symbolic language that the universe uses to communicate to the soul that it is crossing a boundary. Cayce explained that when personal vibration rises, time becomes more fluid, and the barriers between planes begin to dissolve. Past, present, and future begin to coexist in the same tapestry of meaning. Seeing figures, in this context, is like glimpsing fragments of this invisible network, pieces of parallel realities that intertwine with ours. There's something poetic in this vision. The world is a vibrant fabric, and each shadow is a meeting point between the human and the divine. The passage, therefore, is not a distant portal. It is a state of consciousness that begins to manifest within us. Cayce said that the true journey does not happen when the body dies, but when the soul awakens. That is why he called death the great remembrance, the instant when the spirit, free from the limitations of the body, once again sees the whole from which it came. But the beauty of the teaching is that this remembrance can happen in life. Seeing figures, in this sense, is the beginning of that remembering. Many accounts confirm this. People who began to see presences and, after the initial fright, felt a profound transformation, they stopped fearing death, began to value time, compassion, and silence more. It's as if proximity to the invisible revealed the essential. Cayce said that the consciousness of eternity changes the way we love, because when we know that life does not end, love ceases to be an urgency and becomes presence. It ceases to be possession and becomes giving. The soul that sees the invisible learns that nothing needs to be held back, for all that is true remains. There is also the collective dimension of this vision. Cayce predicted that a time would come, and he spoke of this time as being our own, when all humanity would begin to perceive the invisible more clearly. He called this the return of spiritual vision, a natural process of planetary consciousness expansion. Seeing figures in this context is not an isolated phenomenon, but a symptom of a global awakening. Matter is becoming more subtle, spirit more present. The boundaries between worlds are thinning, and what was once the privilege of mystics is becoming common experience. Perhaps this is why so many people today report seeing shadows, lights, figures, subtle movements in the air. The entire planet is changing frequency, and human perception is changing along with it. Cayce said that the spiritual eye is the last to awaken, but the first to understand. We are learning to see again, not with physical eyes, but with the soul's gaze. And this gaze, when it awakens, recognizes what has always been around us, a universe populated by loving presences, by invisible intelligences, by consciousnesses that accompany us. At this point in the journey, the vision of figures is no longer something to be feared, but honored. It is a reminder that the passage, whatever it may be, is near, and that the invisible reveals itself not to scare, but to prepare. The soul that sees is the soul that is ready to cross, to free itself, to remember. And the most beautiful thing of all is that, upon crossing this threshold, one discovers that there was never any separation, that the visible and invisible worlds are just two faces of the same sacred reality that breathes within and outside of us. There's an instant when everything falls silent. Not the silence of an absence of sound, but the silence of an understanding that finally settles. Cayce said that when the soul crosses the passage, whether to another plane or to a new state of consciousness, the whole world seems to hold its breath. It's as if time stops for a moment to witness the birth of something new. This is the true meaning of seeing figures, feeling presences, perceiving the invisible approaching. It is the universe preparing the spirit for a new way of existing. Deep down, all we fear in mystery is change. Death, the invisible, the unknown. All are just metaphors for what the ego cannot control. Cayce, in his serene wisdom, said that nothing dies, only changes form. The passage is not a line separating life from death, but a curve on the path of eternity. And the curious thing is that the more we accept this idea, the more life becomes alive. Because the fear of death is what prevents us from living fully. When the soul recognizes its immortality, fear dissolves and love takes the place of control. He used to affirm that every human being has two births. The first, when the body breathes for the first time. The second, when the soul remembers who it is. Seeing figures, feeling presences, hearing the call of the invisible, all of this can be the beginning of this second gestation. It is the moment when the inner being awakens and begins to guide existence, replacing the fearful mind with the wisdom of the heart. The journey, therefore, is not outward but inward. It is the soul returning home without needing to leave the body. Cayce said that the spiritual world is not above or beyond us, it is within us. Heaven is not a distant place, it is a vibrational state of consciousness. When human beings learn to look inward, the veil separating the worlds dissolves. What we call figures, perhaps, are just reflections of this internal presence projected into the space around us. The universe is a mirror. What manifests outside is what vibrates inside. Thus, when we begin to see shadows and lights, what we are really perceiving is the movement of our own soul, a reflection of the transformation process we are undergoing. And if shadows are the prelude to light, then there is nothing to fear. Every shadow is a promise, every presence is a reminder. Cayce taught that when a soul is about to take a leap in consciousness, it is accompanied by presences that help it make that transition. He called them those who serve on the bridge. These are ancient consciousnesses, some familiar, others unknown, whose function is to ensure that the passage occurs smoothly. They do not come to take, but to guide. They do not come to frighten, but to remember. These beings, which many describe as figures, light silhouettes, subtle perfumes, or light touches, are, according to Cayce, expressions of universal love in action. The love that shows itself not only in words or feelings, but in real presences, which cross dimensions to support a spirit in transition. Seeing figures, then, can be one of the most beautiful and discreet ways for God to say, "You are not alone." The limited human mind translates this into shadow, but the heart, when awakened, recognizes that it is light. Cayce also spoke about the importance of surrender in this process, not the surrender of fear, but the surrender of trust. He said that resisting the passage, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, is like trying to hold the wind with your hands. The energy of transformation is unstoppable. Fighting against it only generates suffering. True wisdom lies in opening your arms and allowing the wind to take what needs to leave. It is in this act of surrender that the miracle happens. The figure ceases to be a shadow and reveals itself as a guide. Darkness transforms into a path. Perhaps the deepest meaning of the phrase, "the passage is near," is precisely this: the loving warning that the time has come to let go of what no longer serves, to release the old self, old beliefs, fears, and attachments that keep us stuck. Each soul has its own time of passage, and it can happen many times in life. There are passages that last a second, a sudden illumination, and there are passages that last for years, in silence, shaping the being from within. But all have the same purpose, to make the soul remember the light that inhabits it. When we understand this, the fear of the invisible transforms into reverence. We begin to walk through life with more attention, more gratitude, more listening. Every shadow becomes a teacher, every presence a reminder that we are being guided. Cayce said that the spiritual world is always speaking, but only those who listen with the heart understand the message. And this is what the phenomenon of figures truly represents, a message, a silent invitation to awaken. The crossing, therefore, is not an external event but a change of perception. When the soul crosses the threshold of fear, it begins to see the world as it truly is, a vast field of interconnected consciousnesses, a single divine breath expressing itself in billions of forms. In this state, life and death cease to be opposites and become complementary, two rhythms of the same eternal song. And what we call end reveals itself as merely a return to the beginning. Cayce used to say that after the passage, the soul does not feel lost, it feels free. Free from the weight of matter, from the limitations of the mind, from self-forgetfulness. And that, even in life, we can experience a glimpse of this freedom. We just need to learn to see with the eyes of the spirit. When this happens, the world gains another dimension. Small things become sacred. Existence ceases to be a sequence of tasks and transforms into contemplation. The awakened soul begins to walk with the lightness of one who knows they are merely passing through, and that every encounter, every farewell, is a thread of eternity interwoven into the fabric of time. And perhaps this is the great secret hidden in Cayce's forbidden interview, what many did not understand at the time. He was not speaking of ghosts, but of remembrance, remembrance of the soul, remembrance of continuity, remembrance that death does not exist. He wanted us to see the figures not as separate entities, but as aspects of our own expanded consciousness, signs that the spirit is awakening to broader dimensions of being. That is why he called death the greatest illusion and fear, the last veil. When we understand this, all existence changes color. Life ceases to be a struggle for survival and becomes an opportunity for growth. We begin to see passage not as loss, but as liberation. The invisible not as a threat, but as companionship. And at this point, the heart calms. The figure that once generated fear now inspires gratitude, because it marks the threshold between what we were and what we are becoming. So if one day you see figures, if you feel presences, if the air seems denser and the silence more alive, do not run away. Breathe. Close your eyes and ask your soul what it is trying to show you. It may be that you are facing your own awakening, the beginning of a crossing, a remembrance that comes to tell you that the passage is near, not a passage to an end, but to the truth. For the truth, as Cayce said, is that nothing is lost, everything transforms, and what we call death is merely the spirit remembering that it has always been light. If this reflection touched something in you, share your experience in the comments. Your story can be the beacon that illuminates the path of another soul in passage. And if you wish to continue this journey of consciousness and remembrance, subscribe to the channel. There is still much to be revealed, and each encounter is a new passage towards the light.